The gun roared in Garrett Mercer's hand, splitting the desert silence like the crack of God's own judgment. The sound echoed across the empty basin, bouncing off red rocks that had witnessed 1,000 deaths and would witness 1,000 more. A man fell. Not gracefully, not like in the stories. He crumpled like a puppet with cut strings face first into the dust, arms spread wide as if trying to embrace the earth that would soon claim him. Garrett stood frozen, the revolver still smoking in his grip, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped animal. Sweat ran down his face, mixing with something else. Blood, maybe. Or tears. He couldn't tell anymore. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper against the wind. They say every man kills the thing he loves. I killed what I loved twice. The words hung in the air, heavy with a truth he couldn't escape. But this moment, this terrible present, was not where the story began. To understand the man standing with a gun and a corpse and the weight of the world on his shoulders, you had to go back. 3 years back to a place called Broken Ridge, where blood soaked into red earth and screams echoed in dreams that never ended. The memory came unbidden, as it always did. Not gentle, never gentle. Broken Ridge, 1878. April, when the desert bloomed with flowers that would die by May. The scene materialized behind Garrett's eyes with the clarity of yesterday. Bodies everywhere, men, women, children. Apache. Scattered like broken dolls across the settlement, the smell of gunpowder mixing with the copper tang of blood and the acrid stench of burning wood. Garrett had been 24 then, wearing Union blue, following orders, believing in something he couldn't even name anymore. The massacre had not been planned, or maybe it had. The line between accident and intention blurred when enough men with guns decided that some lives mattered less than others. He remembered standing in the center of it all, his rifle still warm, his hands shaking. Not from exertion, from horror. That's when he saw her. The girl, Ayasha. 17 years old, though he wouldn't learn her name until much later. She lay crumpled against a burned wall, her dark hair spread around her head like a halo, her traditional dress torn and stained with blood that looked too bright, too red, too real. She was still alive. Her chest moved. Shallow breaths. Her eyes opened just a fraction and found his. Brown eyes, deep as creek water in shadow. Not pleading, not begging, just looking at him with an expression that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Acceptance. She knew she was dying, but in that moment some small part of her still hoped, still believed that maybe, just maybe, this white man with the rifle would choose mercy over orders. Garrett had started to move toward her. His hand reached out, his legs carrying him forward before his mind could catch up. He would save her. He had to. This one girl in this ocean of death, he could pull her back from the edge. That's when the hand clamped down on his shoulder. Lieutenant Marcus Webb. Young, ambitious, terrified of anything that looked like disobedience. Webb pulled him back with surprising strength, his voice harsh in Garrett's ear. "Orders are orders, soldier. Morrison said no survivors. That means no survivors." "She's just a girl." Garrett had said the words, feeling hollow even as he spoke them. "She's Apache. Leave her." Garrett remembered the war inside himself in that moment, the battle between what he knew was right and what he was being told to do. It should have been an easy choice, should have been, but fear is a powerful thing. Fear of court-martial, fear of being branded a traitor, fear of standing alone against the machinery of authority and righteousness and manifest destiny. So Garrett had turned away. He had walked away from Ayasha, leaving her to die alone against that burned wall, and with every step his soul died a little more. The memory released him, spitting him back into the present with the violence of a drowning man breaking the surface. 3 days ago. Not 3 years. The desert near Copper Creek, Arizona Territory. April 1881. Garrett shook his head, trying to clear the ghosts. The text appeared before him, written in the air by memory or madness or both. 3 days earlier. The present snapped into focus with painful clarity. April 15th. Morning. The sun already brutal at 8 a.m., turning the desert into a furnace that would only grow hotter as the day progressed. Garrett Mercer. 37 years old now, rode his gelding through the basin east of his ranch, following the tracks of 3 stray cattle that had wandered north during the night. The horse picked its way carefully through the scrub and stone, sensing his rider's distraction. Garrett barely noticed the landscape. He had stopped seeing beauty 3 years ago, around the time Isabel died. His wife, his anchor, the only thing that had kept him tethered to the world after Broken Ridge. She had known about it, of course. He had told her everything one night when the guilt became too heavy to carry alone. She had listened without judgment, her hand in his, her eyes full of sadness that wasn't for herself, but for him. "You're a good man, Eli," she had said, using the nickname only she was allowed. "Don't let this place change that." But it had changed him. How could it not? And then the consumption took her slowly, cruelly, until all that remained was a body in the ground and a ghost in every room of their small ranch house. Garrett had thought about joining her, many times. The bottle of laudanum under his bed was a comfort and a temptation. Just one long drink, and the pain would stop. The memories would stop. Everything would stop. But he never did it. Some stubborn part of him, maybe the part Isabel had loved, refused to take the easy way out. So instead, he worked. From dawn until his body gave out. Tending cattle, mending fences, fixing things that didn't need fixing. Anything to avoid the silence, the thinking, the remembering. Today should have been like any other day. Track the cattle, bring them back, return to the empty house, eat something tasteless, sleep without rest, wake up and do it all again. But the desert had other plans. The tracks led him deeper into the basin than he usually ventured into territory that bordered Apache land. Dangerous technically, though the Apache had been pushed so far back now that encounters were rare. Most of them were in camps, imprisoned by treaty and circumstance, their land stolen piece by piece until nothing remained but barren ground no white man wanted anyway. That's when Garrett saw the signs of violence. The ground told the story in a language he had learned to read during the war. Disturbed earth, dark stains that had soaked into the red dirt and dried to black, scraps of blue fabric Union cavalry caught on the thorns of mesquite bushes. A fight had happened here. Recently, maybe a week ago, maybe less. Garrett dismounted slowly, his bad leg protesting. A bullet wound from Shiloh that never healed right, leaving him with a permanent limp and a constant reminder that he had survived when better men hadn't. He moved forward carefully, hand near his revolver, eyes scanning for threats. The cattle could wait. This needed understanding. That's when he found her. At first his mind refused to process what his eyes were seeing. A body, yes. But the details came slowly, each one a new horror. A woman. Apache based on what remained of her traditional dress, lying in the shadow of a rock outcropping half covered in dust and dried blood. And where her legs should have been, there were only stumps. Crude bindings wrapped the wounds, once white but now soaked through with brown and red. The flesh around them was swollen, angry, but not yet rotting. Days old, not weeks. And impossibly, terrifyingly, the chest was moving. Shallow breaths, so faint they were almost invisible. But there. She was alive. Garrett stood frozen, his shadow falling across her face. For a moment, time collapsed. This woman became Ayasha. The desert became Broken Ridge. The choice became the same choice he had faced 3 years ago. Save or abandon, mercy or cowardice, the right thing or the safe thing. The woman's eyes opened. Just a fraction. Dark eyes that held the weight of stone and dust and endless sky. They focused on him with the same expression Ayasha had worn. Not fear, not pleading, just quiet acceptance, the look of a warrior who had fought the last fight and lost. Every instinct Garrett possessed screamed at him to walk away. This was trouble of the worst kind. An Apache woman on his land meant death if the wrong people found out. The cavalry would call it treason. The vigilantes would call it race mixing. The bounty hunters wouldn't bother with names at all. He could leave her. The sun would finish what the cavalry had started. She might last another hour, perhaps 2, if she was as strong as she looked. It was the smart choice, the safe choice, the only logical choice for a man who had already lost everything that mattered. But she was breathing. That simple fact held him in place as surely as chains. The shallow rise and fall of her chest, the stubborn refusal to surrender to death. Garrett stood there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. The wind pulled at his coat, the sun burned the back of his neck, and somewhere deep in the hollow place where his heart used to be, something stirred. He had not saved anyone in 3 years, not since the night Isabel died in his arms, her last words a whisper of his name. But maybe, just maybe, he could save this one. A memory flickered, Isabel's voice soft in the darkness of their bedroom. "If I die, I hope you'll become the man I fell in love with, not the ghost you've been since Broken Ridge." Garrett looked at the sky as if searching for an answer written in the clouds. The sky offered only silence and heat and the slow circle of vultures waiting for death to finish its work. He looked back at the woman, at the terrible wounds, at the quiet dignity in her half-open eyes, at the way her fingers had dug into the sand as if trying to hold on to life with nothing but will. "God damn it," he whispered, and the words were both prayer and curse. He stepped forward, knelt beside her in the dirt, and slipped his arms beneath her back and under where her knees should have been. Her body was terrifyingly light, as if the loss of her legs had somehow stolen half her substance, but she was not dead weight. When his hands touched her, she flinched, a small, involuntary tremor that ran through her entire frame. Her eyes opened wider, focusing on his face with sudden, sharp awareness. For a moment they simply looked at each other, a white man and an Apache woman, a Confederate veteran and a survivor. Two people who should have been enemies meeting in the middle of nowhere with death hanging in the air between them like smoke. Garrett did not speak. Words seemed inadequate, even insulting in the face of what she had endured. Instead, he simply stood adjusting her weight against his chest and turned back toward his horse. She made a sound then, a low groan that came from somewhere deep in her chest, the sound of pain that had been held back too long finally breaking free. But she did not struggle, did not fight. As if some part of her understood that this man, this stranger, was choosing to save her when he could have so easily chosen otherwise. Garrett carried her to his horse, the journey across 30 yards of desert taking forever. Each step sent jolts of pain through his bad leg. Each movement made her groan softly. But he did not stop. He had made his choice. Now he would see it through. Getting her onto the horse while mounted himself required careful maneuvering. He settled into the saddle first, then lifted her up, positioning her across his lap. Her head lolled against his chest. Her breathing came fast and shallow against his shirt. The ride back to the ranch took 90 minutes that felt like days. The sun climbed higher, turning brutal. Garrett could feel the fever radiating from her body, the infection already building in her blood. His ranch appeared on the horizon like a mirage, small, rough. The cabin leaned slightly to the left, patched with whatever materials he could salvage. The barn listed in the opposite direction. They held each other up through sheer stubbornness. It was not much, but it was what he had built with his own hands after the war. It was all he had left in the world. He carried her straight through the cabin door and laid her gently on his cot. The narrow frame with its thin wool blanket and single flat pillow, the same bed where Isabel had died. The cabin was a single room, 12 feet by 14, with rough wooden walls and a dirt floor covered by planks he had hewn himself. A fireplace dominated one wall. A table and 2 chairs sat in the center. A rifle rack held 3 weapons. A trunk in the corner contained everything Isabel had owned, still unopened after 3 years. The woman's eyes moved, tracking the room, taking in every detail, even through her pain. She was assessing, Garrett realized. Even now, broken and bleeding, she was a warrior, evaluating her surroundings, searching for threats, planning escape routes. It was the trained response of someone who had fought to survive and refused to stop fighting even when survival seemed impossible. Garrett went to work with the efficiency of a man who had done battlefield medicine during the war. He fetched clean water from the barrel by the door, set a pot to boil on the stove, gathered supplies. Clean cloth torn from an old bedsheet, a bottle of whiskey more than half full because he never touched the stuff anymore. Pine sap mixed with tobacco, an old army remedy for preventing infection. A needle and thread he used for repairing saddles. He returned to the cot and carefully lifted the edge of her dress. The woman tensed immediately, her dark eyes fixing on his face with sudden sharp awareness, her hand moving instinctively toward where a weapon should be. Garrett met her gaze steadily, then deliberately averted his eyes, focusing only on the wounds. His touches were as respectful as the circumstances allowed. The stumps were worse up close. The flesh was swollen and red, the edges of the wounds ragged where whoever had done this had not bothered with clean cuts. But there was no smell of rot yet, no telltale black threading of blood poisoning spreading up what remained of her thighs. The wounds were days old, not weeks. If he worked fast and the fever did not take her, she might live. Garrett cleaned the wounds with boiled water, his hands moving with practiced care. The woman did not cry out, though he felt her entire body go rigid with pain. She simply watched him, her jaw clenched so tight he could see the muscles jumping beneath her skin, her breathing harsh and shallow through her nose. When he unwrapped the old bindings, dried blood and sand fell away in clumps. The wounds beneath were raw and weeping. Garrett washed them again with the whiskey. This time she did make a sound. A sharp intake of breath that might have been the beginning of a scream swallowed before it could escape. Her hand shot out and gripped his wrist with surprising strength, her fingers digging into his skin hard enough to leave marks. Their eyes met again. Hers were filled with pain and fury and something else, something harder to name. A kind of bitter respect perhaps, or merely acknowledgement that this white man was at least trying not to cause more damage than necessary. Garrett applied the pine sap mixture to the wounds, then wrapped them in clean strips of cloth, binding them firmly but not too tight. His hands, though calloused and rough from years of hard work, moved with surprising gentleness. These were the hands that had held Isabel as she died, that had closed her eyes one final time. They remembered how to be tender even when the heart had forgotten. When he finished, the sun was setting beyond the single small window. Orange light slanted across the cabin floor, turning the dust motes in the air to gold. The woman had fallen into an uneasy sleep, her breath coming fast and shallow, the fever already claiming her. Garrett covered her with his blanket, then stood and moved to the far side of the room. He sat at the table, his arms folded on the scarred wood, and watched her chest rise and fall in the failing light. Outside, a coyote called to the rising moon. The windmill creaked. The desert settled into its evening silence. And Garrett Mercer, the man they called the Ghost, felt something he had not felt in 3 long years. Not hope exactly, not purpose, but perhaps the faintest glimmer of something that might in time become one or the other. He had brought a dying woman into his home, an Apache warrior, an enemy of his people, someone whose very presence could destroy what little remained of his life. He had invited danger through his door, danger that could end with a noose around his neck or a bullet in his back. Every rational thought in his head told him he had made a mistake, that he should have left her in the desert, that mercy was a luxury a man in his position could not afford. But as darkness filled the cabin and the woman's quiet breathing became the only sound in the world, Garrett found he could not regret his choice. For the first time since Isabel's death, he had chosen something other than slow suicide. He had chosen life, even if that life belonged to someone else. It would have to be enough. The woman woke before dawn in that gray hour when the world holds its breath between darkness and light. Her eyes opened slowly, focusing on the rough wooden ceiling above her. For a moment she simply lay still, taking inventory of her body, assessing the damage. The pain in her legs was different now, sharper but cleaner. The dull ache of infection replaced by the bright bite of fresh wounds properly tended. She reached down with one hand, her fingers finding the edge of the blanket, then moving lower to touch the bindings. Still there, still gone. The stumps that ended where her legs should continue. The permanent proof of what the cavalry had taken from her. Her throat tightened, but no sound came out. She had already screamed herself raw in the days after the explosion. There were no screams left, only this hollow ache where rage and grief had burned themselves out. A sound outside made her turn her head. boot CPs steady and unhurried crunching across the hard-packed dirt. She tensed her hand, moving automatically to her side, searching for the knife that was no longer there. The door opened, and morning light spilled into the cabin. The white man entered carrying a tin bowl. He moved with that slight limp she had noticed yesterday favoring his right leg. His face was weathered and lined. His brown hair shot through with gray at the temples, though he could not be more than 40. His eyes, pale blue like winter sky, barely glanced at her as he set the bowl on a wooden crate beside the cot. Bread soaked in broth. The smell made her stomach clench with sudden desperate hunger. She had not eaten in 4 days, maybe 5. Time had blurred together in the desert, measured only by the arc of the sun and the slow approach of death. But she did not reach for the food. She just looked at him, her eyes dark and unreadable, waiting to see what he would do, waiting to understand what price this mercy would carry. The man met her gaze without flinching. He did not smile. He did not offer explanations or ask questions. He simply nodded once, a slight dip of his head that might have been acknowledgement or greeting or simply the recognition that she was awake and aware. Then he turned and walked back toward the door. The woman spoke, her voice a cracking rasp that barely qualified as sound. "Silent man." The words came in English, though Apache would have been easier on her raw throat. But she wanted him to understand, wanted to see if he would respond. He paused at the threshold, his back to her, his hand on the door frame. He stood there for a long moment, silhouette against the brightening sky. Then he stepped through and pulled the door closed behind him, leaving her alone with the food and the silence and the strange, unsettling realization that for the first time in days she did not feel like she was dying. Outside, Garrett stood on the porch and looked at the horizon. The sun was breaking over the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. He pulled out his pipe, filled it with tobacco, and lit it with practiced motions. The smoke curled up into the morning air. For just a moment he allowed himself to remember Isabel's voice. "You did the right thing, Eli," she would have said. She had always believed in doing the right thing, even when it cost them, even when it hurt. "I hope so," Garrett whispered to the empty desert. "God help me, I hope so." Inside the cabin, the woman they would come to know as Kaya sat propped against the wall, the bowl of bread and broth in her lap. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, feeling strength return to her body, one spoonful at a time. And as she ate, she studied the cabin around her, noting the rifles on the wall, the lack of any woman's belongings, the single chair at the table, the way dust gathered in the corners because no one cared enough to sweep. This man lived alone. This man was broken in ways that went deeper than the scar on his face or the limp in his walk. This man had saved her not because he wanted something, but because he no longer had anything left to lose. "Silent man," she repeated, testing the name. It fit him. The days that followed established a rhythm. Each morning Garrett would enter the cabin, set down food and water, check her wounds with the same careful respect, then leave. He spoke rarely. She spoke even less, but a language developed between them nonetheless, one of small gestures and careful avoidance, and the understanding that they were both ghosts haunting the same small space. On the third day, Garrett went into town. Copper Creek was 5 miles south, a collection of rough buildings and rougher people trying to scratch out a living from land that did not want to give it. He needed medical supplies, more bandages, carbolic acid for the wounds, laudanum for the pain, though he suspected she would refuse it. The general store was run by Mara Calloway, a compact woman in her mid-40s with gray threading through her black hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of hard years and harder losses. She knew everyone's business because everyone had to buy supplies from her eventually. Garrett had been buying from her for 3 years, ever since Isabel died. Mara had never asked why he lived alone or what demons haunted him. He respected her for that silence. As Garrett approached the counter, he noticed another woman in the store, Rosa Mendoza, arranging canned goods on a shelf. She was newer to Copper Creek, having arrived 2 years ago from Santa Fe after her husband died. Mara had told Garrett once quietly that Rosa's husband had been Apache, that he'd been killed by vigilantes who claimed he'd stolen a horse he'd actually bought and paid for. Rosa never spoke of it, but the weight of that loss lived in her eyes. Rosa glanced at Garrett, offered a small nod of acknowledgement, then returned to her work. She understood what it meant to carry grief in silence. But today, when Garrett set the medical supplies on the counter, Mara's eyes lingered on them. Bandages, carbolic acid, a bottle of laudanum, more than a man with a cut finger would need. "Someone hurt?" she asked, her voice neutral. "Me," Garrett said. Mara looked at him, saw no visible wounds, and knew he was lying. But she did not press. Instead, she wrapped the items carefully, accepted his money, and then did something unexpected. She pulled a newspaper from beneath the counter. The San Francisco Chronicle, several days old but still newsworthy, this far from civilization. "Thought you might want to see this," she said, pointing to a small article on page 3. The headline read, "Broken Ridge Massacre, New Evidence to be Published April 19th. Garrett felt the world tilt. His hands gripped the edge of the counter. 3 days, Mara said quietly. That's when they're releasing the full story. Names, details, everything. Why are you telling me this? Garrett's voice came out hoarse. Mara's eyes held something he could not quite read. Pity, perhaps, or warning. Because I know you were there, Garrett. Isabel told me before she died, and I know what's coming for anyone whose name is on that list. She leaned closer, lowering her voice even though the store was empty. There's a man named Morrison, Captain Samuel Morrison. He's been looking for something your wife took from him. A list, the original. If he finds it before the newspaper publishes, he can claim the story is fabricated. If he doesn't... She trailed off, the implication clear. I don't have any list, Garrett said. Maybe not, but Morrison thinks you do, or thinks you know where it is. He's been asking questions, and he's not the only one. Garrett took the supplies and left without another word. His mind spun as he rode back to the ranch. Isabel had taken something from Morrison. When, why? And what did any of this have to do with the woman currently recovering in his cabin? He arrived home to find Kaya had pulled herself into a sitting position against the wall. She had used her arms to prop herself up the blanket covering what remained of her legs. Her eyes tracked him across the room, sharp and clear, the fever temporarily driven back by rest and medicine. You are troubled, she said, the first full sentence she had spoken to him. Garrett set down the supplies. How do you know? Your face, your walk, the way you hold your shoulders. You carry new weight. He sat down at the table, suddenly exhausted. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, surprising himself, he spoke. There's going to be a newspaper story about a place called Broken Ridge, 3 years ago, where... He stopped, unable to continue. Where many Apache died. Kaya finished for him. Her voice was flat, emotionless. I know of Broken Ridge. My sister died there. The words hit Garrett like a physical blow. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the resemblance he had missed before. The shape of the eyes, the line of the jaw. This woman and Ayasha could have been... Her name was Ayasha, Kaya continued. She was 17. She wanted to be a healer. She collected herbs and learned the old songs. The cavalry came and killed everyone. They said it was because we harbored raiders. But there were no raiders, only families. Garrett's mouth went dry. I'm sorry. Were you there? The question hung in the air between them like smoke. Garrett could have lied, should have lied. But something in her eyes, the same dark eyes that Ayasha had turned on him in her final moments, demanded truth. Yes. Kaya's expression did not change. Did you kill her? No. Did you try to save her? The silence that followed was answer enough. Kaya nodded slowly as if confirming something she had already suspected. Then you are the coward who lives, not the monster who kills. I do not know which is worse. The words should have stung, should have ignited anger or defensiveness. Instead, Garrett felt only the terrible relief of being seen clearly, of having someone finally name the thing he had been too afraid to name himself. I don't know either, he said quietly. They sat in silence as the afternoon light shifted across the cabin floor. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the shutters. A storm was coming, the kind that turned the desert from furnace to freezer in a matter of hours. Garrett stood to prepare the cabin-closing shutters, building up the fire. Kaya watched him work, her eyes never leaving his movements. "Why did you save me?" she asked suddenly. Garrett paused, a log half lifted toward the fireplace. "I don't know. That is not an answer. It's the only one I have." Kaya shifted against the wall, wincing as the movement pulled at her wounds. A man who does not know why he acts is a dangerous man, or a desperate one. Maybe both. "Why are you desperate, silent man?" Garrett placed the log carefully in the fire, watching sparks fly up the chimney. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible over the crackling flames. "Because every day for 3 years I have thought about dying, about joining my wife, about ending the guilt and the memories and the weight of being alive when I should have died at Broken Ridge with all the others." He turned to look at her. "And then I found you, dying in the desert. And for the first time in 3 years, I thought about something other than death. I thought about saving instead of destroying, even if I was only saving you from myself." Kaya studied him for a long moment. "You saved me for you, not for me." "Yes. That is honest, at least." The storm hit an hour later with the violence typical of desert weather. Rain lashed the cabin. Thunder rolled across the basin like artillery fire. Lightning split the sky, throwing stark shadows through the cracks in the shutters. Garrett sat at the table, the newspaper article spread before him. He read it again and again, memorizing the words. New evidence suggests the massacre at Broken Ridge was not a legitimate military action, but a deliberate slaughter of non-combatants. Documents allegedly proving military cover-up to be published April 19th. 3 days. In 3 days, the truth would come out, and everyone whose name was on that list would face consequences. Courts-martial, imprisonment, maybe worse. He thought about Morrison, about the desperation of a man trying to suppress evidence, about what such a man might do to anyone who threatened his freedom. And he thought about the woman in his bed who had just told him her sister died at Broken Ridge, who was perhaps the only living witness to what had really happened that day, a witness Morrison would want silenced. The realization came slowly, like dawn breaking over mountains. Kaya was not just a woman he had saved. She was evidence, living, breathing evidence of a crime Morrison needed buried, and Garrett had just painted a target on both their backs. He looked up to find Kaya watching him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "You have realized something," she said. "You were there, at Broken Ridge. Not just your sister. You." "Yes. I was translator for Fort Bowie. I witnessed many things soldiers did not think I understood." "And Morrison knows this." "Perhaps. That's why they left you in the desert. Not to die from your wounds, but to make sure no one would find you alive." Kaya's lips curved in something that might have been a smile if it held any warmth. "You are not as slow as you pretend, silent man. My name is Garrett, Garrett Mercer. I am Kaya." It was the first time they had exchanged names, the first acknowledgement that they were not simply strangers thrust together by chance, but two people whose fates were now inextricably linked. "Kaya," Garrett said, testing the name. "Morrison will come looking for you, and when he does, he won't come alone." "I know. We should prepare." Garrett met her eyes steadily. "I left your sister to die. I won't make that mistake twice, even if it cost you your life. I'm already dead, have been for 3 years. Maybe this is how I start living again." The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin something shifted. An understanding passed between them. Not trust, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of it. The recognition that they were both damaged people who had found each other in the wreckage of their lives, and that together they might survive what was coming, or at least they would not die alone. That night, as Kaya drifted into uneasy sleep and the storm began to fade, Garrett sat by the window and watched the lightning fade to distant flickers. He thought about Isabel, about the list she had supposedly stolen, about secrets buried and truths about to surface. Tomorrow he would begin preparing, fortifying the cabin, gathering weapons, making ready for the siege he knew was coming. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Garrett Mercer felt something that might have been purpose, might have been redemption, might have been hope. Outside, the desert settled into silence. The storm passed. The stars emerged impossibly bright in the washed, clean sky. And somewhere in the darkness, forces were gathering, men with guns and badges, and the absolute certainty that they were right. Men who would not stop until every witness was silenced and every truth was buried. The clock was ticking. 3 days until the story broke. 3 days to prepare for war. 3 days until Garrett would discover that saving Kaya was only the beginning of a much larger and more dangerous story. A story written in blood and betrayal and the terrible price of redemption. Morning came with the sharp clarity that follows desert storms. The air smelled of wet sage and creosote, that peculiar perfume of the Southwest after rain. Garrett had not slept. He sat at the table, the newspaper article still spread before him, watching the words blur and refocus as exhaustion pulled at his eyes. Kaya woke to find him there motionless as a statue, his hands flat on the scarred wood. "You did not sleep," she observed. "Neither did you." It was true. He had heard her breathing change throughout the night, the rhythm too irregular for genuine rest. They were both haunted by ghosts. Different ghosts, perhaps, but ghosts nonetheless. Garrett stood his joints protesting. His bad leg had stiffened during the night, and he limped more pronounced as he moved to the stove to heat water for coffee. The mundane ritual of morning felt surreal against the weight of what was coming. "I need to tell you something," he said, his back still to her. "About Broken Ridge. About what really happened there. I know what happened. I was there. You know part of it, but there's more. Things I've never told anyone except Isabel." He poured the coffee, dark and bitter, and brought a cup to Kaya. She took it with both hands, grateful for the warmth. The desert morning was cold, the storm having stripped away yesterday's heat. Garrett sat on the edge of the cot, careful not to disturb her legs. For a long moment he simply stared into his own cup, watching steam rise and dissipate. Then he began to speak. "I was 24 years old, 3 years out of the war, trying to forget what I'd seen there. Trying to become someone other than a killer. I joined the cavalry because I needed work, and because I thought maybe protecting settlers was different from shooting boys in gray uniforms." He paused, took a sip of coffee that scalded his tongue. "Morrison was our captain, Samuel Morrison. He was a good officer mostly. Fair. Not cruel like some. He didn't hate the Apache the way others did. I think he just saw them as obstacles to be managed like bad weather or difficult terrain." Kaya's eyes never left his face. She said nothing, waiting. "We got orders to move on Broken Ridge. Intelligence said there were raiders using it as a base. Young warriors who'd been hitting supply trains, stealing horses, killing travelers. The orders were to apprehend the raiders and relocate the settlement to a reservation." Garrett's hands tightened on the cup. "But when we got there, Morrison pulled us aside. Him and his second-in-command, Lieutenant Cullen Hayes. They had a disagreement. I wasn't supposed to hear it, but I was checking the horses nearby and their voices carried." The memory came flooding back with painful clarity. Garrett's voice dropped, taking on the cadence of recollection. "Morrison said the settlement looked peaceful. No warriors, just families. Old men, women, children. He wanted to verify the intelligence before we moved in. Said we should send scouts, make sure we had the right place." Hayes disagreed. He said the orders were clear. Broken Ridge. This was Broken Ridge. The details didn't matter. Indians were Indians, and if we showed weakness, we'd embolden every Apache from here to Mexico. Kaya's jaw tightened, but she remained silent. Morrison argued. "I'll give him that. He said we were soldiers, not murderers. That hitting a peaceful settlement would make us no better than the raiders we were hunting." Hayes got in his face. Told him that if Morrison refused the order, Hayes would report him for cowardice and sympathy with the enemy. Would make sure Morrison never commanded again. Garrett set down his coffee cup, his hands shaking too badly to hold it steady. Morrison caved. He gave the order to advance, to surround the settlement and demand surrender. But Hayes had other ideas. The words came harder now, each one dragged up from a deep well of shame. When the people tried to surrender, Hayes said they were reaching for weapons. He opened fire. His men followed. And once the shooting started, it didn't stop until everyone was dead or dying. Morrison tried to call ceasefire. I heard him screaming at Hayes, but Hayes just kept giving orders, kept his men shooting. By the time it ended, the ground was covered in bodies. 53 people. I counted them later. 53. Kaya's voice when she spoke was ice. And what did you do, Garrett Mercer? I followed orders. I fired when told to fire. I stopped when told to stop. I was a good soldier. You were a coward. Yes. The admission hung in the air between them, stark and unadorned. No excuses, no justifications, just the simple, terrible truth. That's when I saw your sister, Garrett continued, after the shooting stopped. She was alive, barely leaning against a burned wall. I started toward her. I don't know what I was thinking. That I could save her, that I could undo what we'd just done. His voice broke. Lieutenant Webb stopped me. Marcus Webb, Morrison's aide. He grabbed my shoulder, told me Morrison's orders were no survivors, that leaving wounded would only prolong suffering, that mercy meant finishing what we'd started. I stood there frozen while your sister looked at me. She didn't beg, didn't cry. She just looked at me like she knew exactly what I was, a man who would choose his own skin over her life. And then I walked away. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the morning birds seemed to have stopped singing. Kaya stared at him with eyes that held a depth of pain and fury that made him want to look away. But he didn't. He owed her this much, to witness her judgment without flinching. You killed her, Kaya said finally. Not with a bullet, but with your cowardice. You murdered my sister as surely as if you had put a gun to her head. I know. And now you think saving me makes up for that? You think one Apache life can replace another? No, nothing makes up for it. I'm not trying to earn forgiveness. I'm just trying to live with what I did. Kaya's hands gripped the coffee cup so hard Garrett thought it might shatter. How did your wife die, Garrett Mercer? The question caught him off guard. Consumption. Tuberculosis. It took her slowly over 6 months. That is not what I asked. How did she die? What killed her? Garrett's throat tightened. I don't understand. Yes, you do. Tell me the truth. And suddenly he did understand. The truth he had been hiding from himself for 3 years rose up and demanded to be spoken. I told her about Broken Ridge, about Ayasha, about what I'd done and failed to do. She listened without judging, told me I was still a good man, that she forgave me even if I couldn't forgive myself. He stopped fighting for breath. But the next morning something in her had changed. She stopped fighting the disease, stopped taking the medicines Doc Harrison brought, stopped eating more than a few bites. She'd written me a letter that morning, put on her best dress as if she'd made peace with dying. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. The consumption was already killing her. She'd been sick for months. But after I told her about Broken Ridge, she just let go, stopped clinging to life. The disease took her 3 weeks later instead of the 6 months the doctor said she might have had. Kaya finished for him. She could not live knowing what you had become. The doctor said consumption. The town said consumption. And they were right, the disease killed her body. But I killed her will to live. I took away her reason to fight. That's the guilt I carry. And you blame yourself for her death too. I am to blame, not for the tuberculosis, but for the despair that made her stop fighting it. I killed her the same way I killed Ayasha, by being too weak to do the right thing. Kaya set down her cup very carefully. When she spoke, her voice had lost some of its edge, replaced by something more complex. Not forgiveness, but perhaps understanding. Garrett Mercer, you are the saddest man I have ever met. You wear your guilt like armor, thinking it protects you, but it only weighs you down. I deserve to be weighed down. Perhaps, but guilt changes nothing. Ayasha is still dead. Your wife is still dead. You wallowing in shame does not honor them. It only wastes the life they would have wanted you to live. Before Garrett could respond, the sound of an approaching horse cut through the morning air. He was on his feet instantly, hand moving to the rifle by the door. "Stay quiet," he said to Kaya, then moved to the window. A single rider coming fast from the direction of town. As the figure drew closer, Garrett recognized Mara Calloway's distinctive gray mare. He opened the door as she reined in, her face flushed from the hard ride. "Garrett," she said, not dismounting, "you need to hear this. Now." "What happened?" "Morrison's in town. Arrived last night with 8 men. They're not wearing uniforms, but everyone knows they're cavalry. He's asking questions about Apache survivors, about anyone who might have been at Broken Ridge." Garrett's blood turned to ice. "Did he mention me?" "Not by name, but he asked if anyone new had come to the area, if anyone had been buying unusual supplies, medical supplies." "How long before he comes here?" "Hours, maybe less. He's being careful, methodical. But Garrett, there's more." Mara reached into her coat and pulled out a folded letter. The paper was yellowed with age, the handwriting familiar enough to stop Garrett's heart. "This came to my store 3 years ago, addressed to me with instructions not to open it unless something happened to Isabel. I opened it this morning when I heard Morrison was in town." She handed it down to him. Garrett unfolded it with trembling hands. The letter was in Isabel's handwriting, dated 2 weeks before her death. "My dearest Mara," it began. "If you are reading this, I am gone. And if I am gone, it means Garrett needs help he won't ask for. There is a woman, an Apache woman named Kaya. She survived Broken Ridge, though the cavalry doesn't know it. She knows the truth about what happened there, about Morrison's orders, about Hayes's actions, about the list I stole from Morrison's office." Garrett's hands shook so badly he almost dropped the letter. "I am sending a copy of the list to the San Francisco Chronicle with instructions to publish it if I die. The original is hidden where only someone who truly knows me would think to look. If Garrett finds Kaya, if he saves her when he couldn't save the others, then he deserves to know where the list is. It's his choice what to do with it. The list is in my grave, in a metal box sealed with wax placed beside my body. I could not tell Garrett while I lived, because he would have destroyed it to protect himself. But if he saves Kaya, if he chooses redemption over safety, then perhaps he is ready to face the consequences of truth. Tell him I love him. Tell him I forgive him. Tell him to forgive himself." The letter ended with Isabel's signature, elegant, even in her final weeks. Garrett looked up at Mara, his vision blurred with tears. She knew. She knew about Kaya. But how? I don't know. Maybe she heard rumors. Maybe she had sources I don't know about. But Garrett, if Morrison finds out about this letter, about the list being in Isabel's grave, he'll dig her up. He'll desecrate her resting place to get it. From inside the cabin, Kaya's voice rang out. "Let him come. Let them all come. I will testify. I will tell the world what happened at Broken Ridge. Morrison, Hayes, all of them. They will face justice." Garrett turned back into the cabin. "You don't understand what you're saying. Morrison won't let you testify. He'll kill you first. Kill both of us. Then we fight. You can't even walk." Kaya's eyes blazed. "I can shoot. Give me a rifle and high ground, and I will kill any man who comes through that door." Mara had dismounted and followed Garrett inside. She looked at Kaya with a mixture of surprise and something that might have been respect. "You're the woman from Broken Ridge," Mara said. It wasn't a question. "I am Kaya. I was translator for Fort Bowie. I heard Morrison and Hayes argue. I know Morrison did not want the massacre. I know Hayes threatened him, forced his hand." Mara's expression shifted, becoming intent. "Can you prove this?" "I can testify." "Testimony alone won't be enough. Not against a decorated officer. You'd need the list, the one Isabel stole. It has names, dates, details of cover-ups. With that and your testimony, you might have a case." Garrett shook his head. "It's in Isabel's grave. I'd have to dig her up." "Then dig her up," Kaya said flatly. "Your wife wanted the truth told. She died making sure it would be. Honor her wish. I can't. I can't desecrate her grave. You already desecrated her memory by living like a ghost for 3 years. This is your chance to make her sacrifice mean something." The words hit Garrett like physical blows. He looked from Kaya to Mara to the letter still clutched in his hands. "Morrison will be here soon," Mara said. "You need to decide. Dig up the list and face what's coming with evidence. Or burn this letter, hide Kaya, and hope Morrison doesn't find you." "There is a third option," Kaya added. "Give me to Morrison. Tell him I'm the only witness. Let him kill me. Then destroy the list and live out your days in peace." Garrett stared at her. "You think I'd do that?" "I think you have done it before." The accusation hung in the air, undeniable and true. Garrett had chosen safety over righteousness once, at Broken Ridge when he walked away from Ayasha. What would stop him from making the same choice now? He looked down at Isabel's letter, at her final words. Tell him to forgive himself. But how could he forgive himself without first facing what he'd done, without accepting the consequences, paying the price, standing up when it mattered instead of walking away? "Mara," he said quietly, "I need you to do something for me. Name it. Ride to the cemetery. In the tool shed there's a shovel. Start digging up Isabel's grave. I'll join you as soon as I can." Mara nodded and left without another word. The sound of her horse faded into the distance. Garrett turned to Kaya. "I need to move you. If Morrison comes while I'm at the cemetery, you need to be hidden." "I will not hide." "You will if you want to live long enough to testify." His voice was harder now, commanding. The soldier coming back through the guilt-ridden rancher. "There's a cellar, under the floorboards beneath this table. I built it 3 years ago for storing winter supplies. It's big enough for you and supplies for 3 days. A tomb. A sanctuary. If they come, you go down there. You don't come up until I say. And if you do not come back," Garrett met her eyes, "then you wait 3 days. If I'm not back by then, I'm dead. Webb will come. Lieutenant Marcus Webb. He owes me a life debt from the war. I'll leave him a message. He'll get you to San Francisco to the newspapers. You make sure the truth gets told. You plan for your death very calmly." "I've been planning for it for 3 years. The only difference now is I'm planning for something to survive me." He moved to the table and pulled it aside. Beneath, a section of floorboards lifted away to reveal a space beneath. 6 feet by 8, deep enough to crouch or sit, lined with wooden planks to prevent collapse. Garrett had stocked it with water in clay jars, dried meat, hardtack matches, blankets, and weapons. A Winchester rifle, 2 boxes of ammunition, a knife with a blade as long as a man's forearm. "Help me get you down there," he said, "just to make sure you can manage it." Kaya pulled herself to the edge of the opening. Getting down was easier than Garrett expected. She lowered herself with her arms, controlling the descent with practiced strength. She had clearly spent the past days building muscle, preparing for exactly this kind of mobility. Once down, she looked up at him, her face in shadow. "If they come," she said, "I will not stay hidden while you die." "Yes, you will, because you're the only one who can finish what Isabel started. Your testimony matters more than my life. You do not get to decide the value of your life. Neither do you." They stared at each other, locked in a battle of wills. Finally, Kaya nodded. Not agreement, but acknowledgement. Garrett helped her back up, then reset the table and floor. From above, the hiding place was invisible. Unless you knew it was there, you'd never find it. "I'm going to the cemetery now," Garrett said, checking his revolver, strapping on his gun belt. "I'll be back in 2 hours. If Morrison comes before then, you know what to do." "Garrett," he paused at the door, "your wife loved you very much. To plan all of this, to sacrifice herself to save you from yourself. That is great love. I know. Do not waste it." He left without answering, mounting his horse and riding hard toward Copper Creek Cemetery. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the last traces of the storm. The desert returned to its usual state, beautiful and brutal and utterly indifferent to human suffering. Behind him, Kaya sat alone in the cabin, listening to the silence, feeling the weight of the rifle beside her. Ahead of him, Garrett rode toward his wife's grave, toward a truth that had been buried for 3 years, toward a reckoning he could no longer avoid. And somewhere between them, Samuel Morrison and his men were closing in, driven by desperation and the absolute need to silence the past before it destroyed them all. The clock was ticking. 2 days until the newspaper published. Hours until Morrison arrived. And in a grave in Copper Creek Cemetery, sealed in wax and metal, lay a list of names that could bring down an empire or die in silence. Everything depended on what Garrett Mercer chose to do next. Everything depended on whether a coward could become brave enough to do what mattered, even when it cost him everything. The answer lay buried with Isabel. And soon, very soon, it would be unearthed. The Copper Creek Cemetery sat on a low hill 1/2 mile from town, surrounded by a fence of weathered wood that did little to keep out the desert or the dead. Garrett had been here countless times over the past 3 years, standing before Isabel's grave with flowers that wilted in hours and words that never came. Today, he came with a shovel. Mara was already there, the hole half dug, her face streaked with dirt and sweat. She looked up as Garrett dismounted, her expression grim. "I hit the coffin 10 minutes ago," she said. "Haven't opened it. Thought you should be here for that." Garrett took the shovel from her hands. His own were shaking, but he forced them steady. This was the price of truth. This was what Isabel had asked of him. He jumped down into the grave, the walls of earth rising around him like the sides of his own tomb. The coffin was simple pine, weathered but intact. He had built it himself, working through the night after Isabel died, his hands raw and bleeding by the time he finished. Now he would open it. He wedged the shovel under the lid and pried. The wood groaned in protest, nails pulling free with sounds like small screams. The lid came away slowly, revealing the interior. Garrett's breath caught in his throat. Isabel lay as he had left her, wrapped in her best dress, her hands folded across her chest. 3 years in the dry desert air had mummified rather than decayed her. Her face was sunken, leathery, but recognizable. The woman he had loved, preserved by climate and circumstance into something that was neither living nor fully gone. Beside her, exactly as the letter described, lay a metal box, sealed with red wax, stamped with Isabel's ring, the one her mother had given her. Garrett reached for it with trembling hands. A voice rang out across the cemetery, cold and commanding. "Step away from that box, Mr. Mercer." Garrett's head snapped up. Standing at the edge of the grave, silhouetted against the morning sun, was a man in civilian clothes with a military bearing. 50-ish gray at the temples, eyes hard as flint. Captain Samuel Morrison. Behind him stood another man, younger, with a face Garrett recognized from nightmares, Lieutenant Marcus Webb. But Webb's gun was not pointed at Garrett. It was pointed at Morrison. "Step away, Garrett," Webb said quietly, "and bring the box with you." Garrett climbed out of the grave, the metal box clutched to his chest. He stood between Morrison and Webb, caught in a crossfire he did not fully understand. Morrison's hand rested on his own sidearm, but he did not draw. "Lieutenant Webb, you are making a grave mistake. Lower your weapon." "No, sir. I've made enough mistakes following your orders. I won't make another. I never ordered the massacre at Broken Ridge." "No, but you allowed it. You stood by while Hayes butchered civilians. That makes you complicit." Morrison's face tightened. "Hayes threatened court-martial. He had connections power. If I had refused, he would have destroyed my career and then carried out the attack anyway. I made a tactical decision." "You made a coward's decision," Webb shot back. "The same decision I made when I told Garrett not to save that girl. We both chose our careers over lives, and we've both been paying for it ever since." Garrett found his voice. "Why are you here, Webb? I thought you'd be with Morrison." "I was, until yesterday when I realized what he planned to do." Webb's eyes never left Morrison. "He's not here to suppress evidence, Garrett. He's here to kill anyone who threatens to expose it, including you, including the woman you're hiding." Morrison's laugh was bitter. "You think you're the hero in this story, Webb? You're as guilty as I am. Your name is on that list, too." "I know. and I'm prepared to face the consequences. That's why I'm here, to make sure the truth comes out no matter what it costs me." Noble, but stupid. Morrison's hand tightened on his gun. "There are 8 men surrounding this cemetery right now, all loyal, all willing to do what's necessary. You might shoot me, but you'll both die before you leave this place." Mara stepped forward, a shotgun in her hands that Garrett had not noticed before. "Then they'll have to shoot me too. And the 15 townspeople I brought with me. They're positioned around your men right now, Morrison. You're outnumbered." Morrison's eyes flicked to the surrounding hills. Garrett saw it too. Figures emerging from behind tombstones from the scrub beyond the fence. Not soldiers, townspeople, shopkeepers, ranchers, the blacksmith, even old Doc Harrison with a hunting rifle. "Mara, what did you do?" Garrett breathed. "What Isabel would have wanted. I told them the truth, about Broken Ridge, about the list, about Morrison's plan to silence witnesses. Turns out a lot of people in this town are tired of soldiers treating them like enemies on their own land." Morrison's face had gone pale. "This is mutiny, treason." "This is justice," Mara replied. "Now call off your men and surrender, or we'll have a bloodbath right here in consecrated ground." For a long moment no one moved. The standoff balanced on a knife's edge, one wrong word or movement away from violence that would leave bodies scattered among the graves. Then a new voice cut through the tension. "Nobody needs to die today." A rider came up the hill, moving slowly, hands visible and empty. As he drew closer, Garrett recognized the face beneath the wide-brimmed hat. Dion Thatcher, Kaya's brother. He dismounted carefully, keeping his movements non-threatening. "Captain Morrison, I have a message from my sister. She says you did not want Broken Ridge to happen. She says Hayes forced your hand. She's willing to testify to that fact." Morrison's expression flickered. Hope, perhaps, or suspicion. "Your sister is alive." "She is. No thanks to you leaving her in the desert. But she survived, and she remembers everything, including your argument with Hayes, including how you tried to stop it." "Then why would she testify for me?" "Not for you, for the truth. She wants Hayes punished. She wants the real guilty parties exposed. If your crime was cowardice rather than cruelty, she'll say so, but only if you surrender now, only if you stop trying to bury what happened." Morrison looked at the box in Garrett's hands, at Webb's guns still trained on him, at the townspeople surrounding them, at the choice that lay before him like an open grave. "If I surrender," he said slowly, "I'll face court-martial, probably prison." "Yes," Webb agreed, "but you'll live, and more importantly, the truth will live. Hayes and the others who actually pulled the triggers will face justice too. And if I fight, then you die here, today, and you die a murderer trying to cover up mass slaughter. Is that how you want your name remembered?" Morrison's hand fell away from his gun. The fight went out of him like air from a punctured bladder. He suddenly looked old, tired, beaten. "I've been running from this for 3 years," he said quietly. "Every night I see their faces, the children, the old women, all of them looking at me like Ayasha looked at me before she died." Garrett's head snapped up. "You saw Ayasha." "I saw all of them. I gave the order to advance. I failed to stop Hayes when I should have. Their blood is on my hands even if I didn't fire the shots." Morrison met Garrett's eyes. "You think you're the only one who can't sleep? The only one haunted?" "I've been a ghost too, Mercer. Just one who kept moving instead of standing still." Webb lowered his gun slowly. "Then let's stop being ghosts. Let's face what we did and accept the consequences." Morrison nodded, the gesture heavy with defeat and something that might have been relief. "I surrender, but I have conditions." "You're not in a position to make conditions," Mara said. "Not for me. For my men. They were following orders. Most of them didn't even fire their weapons at Broken Ridge. They shouldn't hang for my failures." Webb considered this. "We'll testify to that. The men who actually committed murder will be identified and charged. The others will be judged accordingly." "And Hayes?" Hayes is mine, Dion said, his voice cold as winter. He's been hiding in Mexico, but I know where. I'll bring him back for trial. Morrison unbuckled his gun belt and let it fall. Then it's done. Take me in. As Webb moved to secure Morrison, Garrett became aware of movement behind him. He turned to see Kaya approaching on horseback, Dion having clearly brought her from the ranch. She should not have been riding, should not have been out of bed at all with her wounds still healing. But she sat the saddle with the aid of leather straps Dion had rigged, her face pale but determined. She looked down at Morrison with eyes that held an ocean of pain and anger and something more complicated than either. You are a coward, Samuel Morrison, but you are not Hayes. You did not kill my sister with your hands, only with your weakness. Morrison met her gaze. I know, and I'll carry that for whatever days I have left. Good. You should. Kaya's expression softened fractionally. But when you stand trial, I will tell the truth. That you tried to stop it. That Hayes threatened you. The judges will still convict you, but they will know you were weak, not evil. There is a difference. Thank you, Morrison said, and the words held genuine gratitude. Kaya turned to Garrett. Did you find the list? He held up the metal box. Not opened yet. Then open it. Let us see what Isabel died protecting. Garrett broke the wax seal with hands that shook despite his efforts to steady them. Inside the box lay papers carefully preserved, wrapped in oilcloth. The Broken Ridge list. 47 names, ranks, dates, detailed accounts of who did what, who fired into the crowd, who set the fires, who killed the wounded, who tried to stop it and failed, who covered it up after. Morrison's name was there, marked with a note in Isabel's handwriting. Gave initial order under duress, attempted to call ceasefire, failed to prevent massacre or report it after, guilty of cowardice and cover-up, not murder. Hayes's name was circled in red ink with a long list of specific atrocities detailed beneath it. Webb's name appeared with the notation, prevented Garrett Mercer from attempting rescue of wounded, enforced Morrison's orders, complicit. And Garrett's own name written in Isabel's careful script, did not fire on civilians, attempted rescue but was prevented, walked away, complicit through inaction. Below the list, one final note from Isabel. The world will judge these men, but I have already judged the one who matters most to me. Garrett Mercer is guilty of cowardice, not cruelty. He can be redeemed if he chooses. This list is his choice. Destroy it and live in shame, or expose it and live in truth. I pray he chooses truth. I pray he chooses to be the man I married, the man who, when given a second chance, will not walk away. Garrett's vision blurred with tears. 3 years Isabel had been gone. 3 years he had mourned her. And only now did he understand the depth of her sacrifice. She had not just died of consumption. She had died completing a mission, stealing the list, sending copies to newspapers, hiding the original where it would force Garrett to literally dig up his past, all of it planned to give him a chance at redemption. She loved you very much, Kaya said softly. I know. I just wish I'd deserved it. Perhaps now you will earn it. Webb stepped forward. Garrett, I need to take Morrison into custody, and I need that list as evidence. Will you give it to me? Garrett looked at the papers in his hands. The power to destroy lives, to exact vengeance, to hide truth or expose it. Isabel's words echoed in his mind. This list is his choice. He handed it to Webb. Make sure it gets to the right people. Make sure Hayes faces trial. Make sure everyone knows what really happened. I will. You have my word. And Webb, your name is on here too. I know. I'll face what's coming. It's past time. As Webb led Morrison away, surrounded by townspeople who had transformed from mob to witnesses, Garrett turned back to Isabel's grave. The coffin still lay open, her preserved face looking up at the sky. Mara touched his arm gently. We should close it. Give her rest. In a moment. Garrett climbed back down into the grave, kneeling beside his wife's body. He reached out and touched her folded hands, the leather skin cold, but not unrecognizable. "I found her, Isabel. The woman you wrote about. Kaya. I saved her like you knew I would. And I'm going to see this through. Going to testify. Going to make sure the truth comes out no matter what it costs me." He paused, throat tight. "I'm sorry I wasn't the man you needed me to be when you were alive. But I'm going to try to become that man now. For you. For Kaya. For all the people who died at Broken Ridge." He leaned down and kissed her forehead, the gesture more symbolic than romantic, given her state. "Rest now. Your mission is complete. You saved me after all." He climbed out of the grave and helped Mara replace the coffin lid. Together they filled in the earth, restoring Isabel's rest. When they finished, Garrett stood over the mounded dirt, hat in hand. "Goodbye, my love. Thank you for not giving up on me even after you were gone." Kaya had dismounted and pulled herself to sit on a nearby headstone, watching the proceedings with thoughtful eyes. As Garrett approached, she spoke. "Your wife was a remarkable woman. To plan all this, to sacrifice herself to save you from yourself, that is great love." "It is. I just hope I can live up to it." "You already have. By opening that grave, by giving Webb the list, by choosing truth over safety." She paused. "But Garrett, you know what comes next." "Yes." "Trial. Prison, probably." "Yes. And Morrison's men will not all surrender peacefully. Some will fight. There will be blood before this is finished." "I know. Are you prepared for that?" Garrett looked at the freshly filled grave, then at the metal box that had contained the list, now empty. Then at Kaya, this woman he barely knew, but who had somehow become the center of his world. 3 days ago I was prepared to die, to drink laudanum and follow Isabel into whatever comes after. But now," he met her eyes, "now I'm prepared to live. Even if living means fighting, even if it means prison, even if it means facing every consequence of what I did and didn't do at Broken Ridge." "Good." Kaya's expression softened. "Because I am not finished with you yet, silent man. You saved my life. Now you help me rebuild it, and I help you rebuild yours." "Is that how this works?" "That is how it must work. We are bound now, you and I, by blood and truth and the dead who refuse to let us forget. We honor them by living well, by fighting for justice, by refusing to be ghosts any longer." Garrett extended his hand. Kaya took it, her grip strong despite her injuries. "Partners, then," Garrett said. "Partners." Kaya agreed. Behind them the town was beginning to stir. Word of Morrison's surrender would spread quickly. The newspaper would publish tomorrow, one day early, now that the main source was in custody. The territory would erupt in scandal and outrage. But for this moment, standing in the cemetery with the woman he had saved, and who had in turn saved him, Garrett Mercer felt something he had not felt in 3 years. Peace. Not the peace of the grave, but the peace of a man who had finally stopped running from his past and was ready to face his future, whatever it might bring. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last shadows of the storm. The desert spread around them, beautiful and brutal and alive. And in that moment Garrett understood what Isabel had been trying to tell him all along. Redemption was not about erasing the past. It was about having the courage to face it, to accept its weight, and to keep moving forward anyway. To choose life over death, truth over lies, action over paralysis. To become finally the man he should have been all along. The journey would not be easy. There would be trials, literal and metaphorical. There would be prison bars and public shame and the weight of judgment from a world that did not forgive easily. But he would not face it alone. He had Kaya. He had Webb. He had Mara and the townspeople who had chosen to stand with truth. And he had Isabel's love still reaching across the boundary of death to guide him home. It would have to be enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. 3 months later, San Francisco stood gleaming under a July sun that turned the bay to molten silver. The federal courthouse on Montgomery Street had seen its share of landmark cases, but none quite like this. The courtroom was packed wall to wall with reporters, soldiers, civilians, and spectators who had traveled from across the territory to witness what newspapers were calling the trial of the century. United States versus Morrison and 46 others. The Broken Ridge Massacre. Garrett Mercer sat in the third row wearing the only suit he owned, borrowed 3 years ago for Isabel's funeral and not worn since. Beside him, Kaya sat in the wheelchair he had built for her, modified now with better wheels and padding, thanks to donations from unexpected supporters across the country. The case had become a sensation. Isabel's list, published in full by the San Francisco Chronicle, had ignited a firestorm of outrage. Public opinion split sharply. Some called the accused soldiers patriots doing difficult work in hostile territory. Others called them murderers hiding behind uniforms. But everyone wanted to hear from the sole survivor, the Apache woman who had witnessed it all. The prosecutor was a sharp-faced man named Thomas Whitmore, brought in from Washington specifically for this case. He stood now addressing the jury of 12 men, all white, all property owners as required by law. Gentlemen of the jury, over the next weeks you will hear testimony that will challenge everything you believe about honor, duty, and the rule of law. You will hear how 47 United States soldiers, men sworn to protect the innocent, instead became executioners of women, children, and old men whose only crime was being Apache. He paused, letting the words sink in. The defense will argue that these men were following orders in a time of war, that the line between combatant and civilian is blurred in frontier conflicts. That split-second decisions in the fog of battle cannot be judged from the comfort of this courtroom. Whitmore's voice hardened. But this was not the fog of battle. This was a massacre. Deliberate, sustained, and covered up for 3 years until one brave woman, Mrs. Isabel Mercer, sacrificed her life to ensure the truth would not die with her. He turned to face the defendants. Morrison sat at the center of the long table, flanked by lawyers and fellow accused. His face was gaunt, aged a decade and 3 months. To his right sat Marcus Webb, who had insisted on being tried alongside Morrison despite offers of immunity in exchange for testimony. To his left, 13 other soldiers' ranks ranging from private to lieutenant. The remaining 33 defendants were being tried separately. Some had fled and were being sought. But the most important fugitive, Lieutenant Cullen Hayes, remained at large despite a massive manhunt across Mexico and the southwestern territories. "We will prove," Whitmore continued, "that Captain Morrison gave the order to attack a peaceful settlement, that he failed to stop the slaughter when it spiraled beyond control, that he then conspired to cover up what happened, and most damning of all, that he hunted and attempted to murder the one witness who could expose his crimes." Morrison's lead attorney, a silver-haired veteran named Lawrence Hendricks, rose smoothly. "Objection. The prosecution is presenting closing arguments as opening statements. There is no evidence Captain Morrison attempted to murder anyone." "Sustained," Judge Augustus Ward declared. "Mr. Whitmore, confine yourself to what you intend to prove, not your interpretation of events." "Yes, Your Honor." Whitmore returned to the jury. "We will present evidence, documents, testimony, and we will introduce you to a woman who has more courage than all 47 of these defendants combined. A woman who survived not just the massacre but the attempted murder that followed. A woman who now speaks for the 53 souls who cannot speak for themselves." He gestured toward Kaya. "Miss Kaya will tell you what happened at Broken Ridge, and when she is finished you will have no choice but to deliver justice for the dead." Hendricks rose again for the defense. His strategy was immediately clear: acknowledge, minimize, redirect. "Gentlemen, my client does not deny that a tragedy occurred at Broken Ridge. War is hell, as General Sherman famously said, and in hell terrible things happen. But Captain Morrison is not a monster. He is a career soldier who found himself in an impossible situation, forced to choose between following orders and committing career suicide." He walked slowly before the jury box. "Lieutenant Hayes, who remains a fugitive and cannot defend himself here, was the instigator. He pressured Captain Morrison. He threatened him. And when the attack began, it was Hayes and his men who fired into the crowd. Not my client. Captain Morrison tried to stop it. He called for ceasefire. He was ignored." The prosecution will paint Morrison as a murderer and cover-up artist. But the evidence will show he was a good man caught in a bad situation who made the best choices he could under enormous pressure. That is not murder, gentlemen. That is the fog of war. The opening statements continued for 2 hours, each side laying out their narrative, framing the case in terms favorable to their position. When they finally finished, Judge Ward called for the first witness. The prosecution may call its first witness. Whitmore stood. The United States calls Miss Kaya to the stand. The courtroom fell silent as Garrett wheeled Kaya forward. The aisle between the gallery and the witness stand had been widened to accommodate her chair. Every eye in the room followed her progress. She wore a simple dress, dark blue, that Mara had helped her choose. Her hair was pulled back in the traditional Apache style. Around her neck hung the medicine pouch Rosa had given Garrett months ago, the one that had belonged to her murdered husband. The bailiff approached with a Bible, but Kaya shook her head. "I will not swear on your God's book. I will swear on the memory of my sister and the 52 others who died. That oath means more to me than any other." Judge Ward considered this. "Miss Kaya, the law requires an oath on the Bible or affirmation of truthfulness. Will you affirm that your testimony will be truthful under penalty of perjury?" "I will. I do not lie. It is not the Apache way." "That is sufficient. Please state your full name for the record." "I am Kaya of the Chiricahua Apache. I have no other name in your language." Whitmore approached, his manner respectful. "Miss Kaya, will you tell the jury where you were on April 14th, 1878? "I was at Broken Ridge. It was my home." "What was your role there?" "I was translator for Fort Bowie. The Army hired me because I spoke English and Apache and Spanish. I traveled between the fort and the settlements helping with negotiations and trade." "Were you at Broken Ridge in a military capacity that day?" "No. I was visiting my sister Ayasha. It was her naming day ceremony. She was becoming a woman. I had brought gifts from the fort." Kaya's voice remained steady, but Garrett, watching from the gallery, could see the tension in her shoulders, the white knuckle grip on the arms of her wheelchair. "What happened that day, Miss Kaya? In your own words, tell the jury what you witnessed." And Kaya told them. She described the morning peaceful and full of celebration. Children playing, women preparing food, old men sitting in the shade telling stories. No warriors, no weapons, just families. She described the cavalry arriving, the shock of seeing so many soldiers surrounding the settlement, the confusion when Captain Morrison called for everyone to gather. "Morrison spoke through me," Kaya said. "He told the people they were being relocated to the reservation. He said anyone who resisted would be arrested. He seemed nervous. His hands shook when he gave me the words to translate." "Did the people resist?" "No. They were afraid, yes. Angry, yes. But they did not fight. They gathered as ordered. Old men, women, children. They stood in the center of the settlement with their hands visible." "What happened next?" Kaya's voice dropped, became harder. Lieutenant Hayes rode forward. He argued with Morrison. I was close enough to hear. Hayes said the orders were to eliminate the threat, not relocate. Morrison said these were not threats, they were families. Hayes said Indians were Indians, and we were all threats by nature. Morrison told Hayes he would not order his men to fire on unarmed civilians. Hayes said if Morrison did not give the order, Hayes would report him for dereliction and give the order himself. He said he had friends in Washington who would believe his version of events over Morrison's. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Ward banged his gavel. "What did Captain Morrison do?" Whitmore asked. "He gave the order to advance, to surround the people, but not to fire. He was very specific. No firing unless fired upon." "And were his soldiers fired upon?" "No, there were no weapons. Nothing." "Then what happened?" Kaya took a breath, steadying herself. "Hayes drew his pistol and shot an old man named Nietzsche, shot him in the head while he stood with hands raised. Nietzsche fell. His wife screamed and ran to him. Hayes shot her too. The other soldiers looked to Morrison. Morrison shouted, 'Cease fire, cease fire.' But Hayes rode among his men shouting to engage to return fire, that we were attacking. It was a lie, but his men believed him or pretended to believe him." The shooting started. Bullets everywhere. People ran. Children screamed. Hayes and his men chased them down, shooting them as they fled. Some tried to hide in homes. The soldiers set fire to the buildings. Her voice broke for the first time. My sister Ayasha was in one of those buildings. I saw her run inside to save a child. The soldiers barred the door and lit the fire. I heard her screaming. I tried to reach her, but someone hit me from behind. When I woke, the building had collapsed. Ayasha was dead. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Several jury members had tears in their eyes. Even Hendricks, the defense attorney, looked shaken. How many people died that day, Miss Kaya? 53. I counted the bodies afterward. 22 children, 18 women, 13 old men, all unarmed, all innocent. And Captain Morrison, what was he doing during the massacre? He was shouting, trying to stop it. I saw him physically pull one soldier away from a woman, but there were too many. Hayes had control of the men. Morrison could not stop it. Whitmore paused, letting the testimony sink in. After the massacre, what happened? Morrison ordered everyone to fall back. He looked destroyed, like a man whose soul had died. Hayes was laughing, actually laughing. He said they had won a great victory. Morrison argued with Hayes again, said this would be reported that Hayes would hang for what he did. Hayes said no one would believe Morrison, said he would claim Morrison gave the order and Hayes tried to stop it, that his men would back his story. And did they? Some did. Some refused. That is why your list has 47 names instead of 100. Some soldiers would not lie. What happened to you after this? Morrison saw me. He knew I had heard everything. He knew I spoke English and could testify. He told Hayes I was a witness that I needed to be secured. But Hayes said witnesses were loose ends. He had 2 soldiers take me into the desert and deal with me. How did you lose your legs, Miss Kaya? Her jaw tightened. The soldiers were supposed to shoot me, but one of them, Private William Carver. He could not do it. He was young. He had seen enough death, so they made a compromise. They would leave me in the desert to die naturally, but first they would make sure I could not walk back for help. The courtroom gasped. They used black powder from their rifles, placed it around my legs below the knees, set it to explode. The blast was supposed to kill me. Instead, it only destroyed my legs. They left me there certain I would die within a day. But you survived. I survived. My brother Dion found me days later. He thought I was dead. When he saw I lived, he could not carry me and escape the soldiers who were still in the area. So he left me, promised to return, but he did not. She looked directly at Dion, who sat in the gallery, his face buried in his hands. I do not blame him. He was scared. We all make choices when we are scared. Some of us live with those choices. Some of us die from them. Whitmore let the statement hang for a moment. Miss Kaya, in your expert opinion, as someone who was there, who witnessed everything, who heard the arguments between Morrison and Hayes, who bears primary responsibility for the Broken Ridge massacre. Hayes bears primary responsibility. He pulled the trigger. He gave the orders to his men. He laughed while children died. He is the monster. And Captain Morrison? Kaya looked directly at Morrison, who met her gaze with eyes full of guilt and resignation. Morrison is a coward. He failed to stop Hayes when he should have. He chose his career over lives. But he is not Hayes. He did not want this to happen. He tried to stop it even if he failed. That does not excuse him, but it is the truth. No further questions, Your Honor. Hendricks rose for cross-examination, but his usual aggressive style was subdued. Even he seemed affected by Kaya's testimony. Miss Kaya, you have suffered terribly. No one in this room disputes that. But I must ask, do you have any bias against Captain Morrison? Any reason to exaggerate his culpability? I have every reason to hate Morrison. He gave the order that led to my sister's death. But I do not lie. I tell you what I saw and heard. If that helps Morrison, so be it. If it hurts him, so be it. I speak for the dead. They deserve truth, not revenge. You testified that Morrison tried to stop the shooting, that he called ceasefire. that he physically pulled soldiers away from victims. Does that sound like a man who wanted a massacre? No. It sounds like a man who let a massacre happen because he was too weak to stop it when it mattered. Is weakness a crime in a man with power and responsibility? Yes, it is the worst crime, because strength could have saved lives. Weakness killed them. Hendricks had no response to that. He returned to his seat, defeated. The trial continued for 3 weeks. Other witnesses testified. Soldiers who had been there, civilians who had helped cover up the massacre, expert witnesses on military protocol and the laws of war. Garrett was called to testify on day 12. He described what he had seen, what he had failed to do, and how the guilt had destroyed his life until Isabel's final act of love had given him a chance at redemption. When asked why he did not save Ayesha, he answered simply, "Because I was a coward. I chose my safety over her life. I have to live with that, but I will not compound that sin by lying about what happened." Captain Morrison gave the order to advance. Lieutenant Hayes gave the order to fire. I and others like me followed orders we knew were wrong. We are all guilty. The only question is degree. Webb testified similarly, his voice steady as he described his own failures and his decision to finally stand for truth. The defense presented character witnesses for Morrison, fellow officers who spoke of his distinguished service, his fairness, his attempts to treat the Apache with respect. They painted a picture of a good man caught in an impossible situation. But the prosecution's evidence was overwhelming. The list, the testimony, the documented cover-up. On August 3, 1881, the jury returned their verdict. The foreman stood a sheet of paper trembling in his hands. In the case of the United States versus Samuel Morrison on the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, we find the defendant guilty. Morrison's face showed no surprise. He simply nodded. On the charge of failure to prevent atrocities under his command, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to cover up war crimes, guilty. The verdicts continued. Guilty on most counts. Not guilty on the charge of personally committing murder, as Kaya's testimony had made clear. Morrison had not pulled the trigger. Sentencing came a week later. "Captain Samuel Morrison," Judge Ward intoned, "you have been found guilty of grave crimes against humanity. While you did not personally massacre the innocents at Broken Ridge, your failure to prevent it and your subsequent cover-up make you complicit in their deaths. This court sentences you to 20 years hard labor at the Territorial Prison. You will be stripped of rank and dishonorably discharged. You will never again wear the uniform of the United States Army." Morrison stood to receive his sentence with dignity. "I accept the court's judgment. It is less than I deserve." Webb received 10 years for his role reduced because of his cooperation and testimony. 13 other soldiers received sentences ranging from 2 to 15 years, and there remained one empty chair at the defense table, reserved for Lieutenant Cullen Hayes, still a fugitive, still unpunished. But that chapter was not yet closed. After the sentencing, Garrett and Kaya stood on the courthouse steps surrounded by reporters shouting questions. Garrett raised his hand for silence. "Justice was served today, but it is incomplete. Lieutenant Hayes, the man most responsible for the Broken Ridge massacre, remains free. We will not rest until he faces trial. Until then, this victory is hollow." A reporter shouted, "Mr. Mercer, you were sentenced to 5 years probation. How do you feel about that?" "Grateful and undeserving. I should be in prison with Morrison. That I am not is only because I was lucky enough to find a second chance. Not everyone gets that." "Miss Kaya, what will you do now?" Kaya looked at the assembled crowd, at the people who had traveled across the country to support her, at the Apache delegation who had come from the reservations to witness justice for their people. "I will continue to speak, to teach, to make sure what happened at Broken Ridge is never forgotten and never repeated. And I will help hunt Lieutenant Hayes. He will face justice. I promise you this." As they descended the courthouse steps, Dion approached his hat in his hands. "Kaya, His voice broke. "I am sorry. For leaving you. For being a coward like Morrison. For failing you." Kaya looked at her brother, This man who had abandoned her to die, who had lived with that guilt every day since. You came back, Dion. In the end you stood with me. You helped bring Morrison in. You testified. That counts for something. Does it count enough? I do not know. But we are family. And family means we keep trying. Keep failing. Keep trying again. So yes, brother, you are forgiven. Now earn it. Dion embraced her, tears streaming down his face. I will. I swear I will. That evening, as the sun set over San Francisco Bay, turning the water to gold and crimson, Garrett and Kaya sat on the balcony of their hotel room, watching the city come alive with gaslight. It is not finished, Kaya said quietly. No, Hayes is still out there. And Morrison will die in prison. Webb too, probably, the others, all paying for their crimes. As they should. As you should. You were sentenced to probation, but you sentenced yourself to something worse. Eternal guilt. Garrett was quiet for a long moment. Isabel wrote in her letter that I should forgive myself. But how can I? Ayesha is still dead. All those people are still dead. My being free does not change that. No. But your guilt does not change it either. You cannot bring them back. You can only live in a way that honors their memory. By speaking truth. By fighting for justice. By being the man you failed to be at Broken Ridge. She reached over and took his hand. Isabel gave you a second chance. I am giving you a third. Do not waste it. Garrett squeezed her hand, feeling the strength in her grip, the life that refused to surrender. What happens now? After the trial, after Hayes is caught, after all of this? Kaya smiled, and for the first time since he had met her, it reached her eyes. Now we live Garrett Mercer. We build something from these ruins. We teach others. We love if we can. We survive if we must. We become more than the worst things that happen to us. Together. Together. As darkness fell over San Francisco, the trial concluded, but the story far from over. Two broken people sat together and watched the stars emerge one by one. The past could not be changed. The dead could not be resurrected. Justice was imperfect and incomplete. But they were alive. They had spoken truth. They had faced consequences. And in facing them, they had found something neither expected. Not absolution, not forgetting, but perhaps finally the possibility of peace. 10 years later, April 1891. The desert had not changed. It never did. The same red rocks thrust toward the sky like broken teeth. The same scrub brush clung to life in impossible soil. The same wind carried the scent of sage and dust and something older than memory. But the people who crossed it had changed utterly. Garrett Mercer, 47 years old, now rode his horse along the familiar trail to Copper Creek, his bad leg still aching in the morning cold, but no longer slowing him down. His hair had gone mostly gray, deep lines carved into his face by sun and time and the weight of carrying truth. He was no longer a ghost. The haunted look that had defined him for so many years had faded, replaced by something harder to name. Peace was too strong a word. But perhaps acceptance. Perhaps the quiet dignity of a man who had faced his worst self and survived the encounter. Beside him rode Kaya, seated on a horse with the special saddle Garrett had refined over the years. She wore prosthetic legs now carved from wood and fitted with leather padding made by a craftsman in San Francisco who specialized in helping war veterans. They allowed her to walk short distances with the aid of canes, though she still preferred her wheelchair for longer journeys. She was 38 now, her face carrying its own map of survival. But her eyes remained sharp, her spirit unbroken. She had become a teacher traveling between Apache settlements and white towns, teaching children of both cultures to read and write and understand that the other was human. Her school in Copper Creek was small but thriving. 20 students, Apache and white, sitting side by side, learning together. It was a revolution in miniature, one that had taken 10 years of patient work to build. Behind them, riding a smaller horse, was a boy of 8 years old. Dion Ayesha Mercer, named for the uncle who had sacrificed himself and the aunt who had died at Broken Ridge. He had his mother Kaya's dark eyes and his father Garrett's stubborn chin. Adopted, yes, but theirs in every way that mattered. The boy who insisted everyone call him Day was chattering about the upcoming spring festival, his voice bright with excitement. He had never known the darkness that had defined his parents' early lives. That was intentional. Garrett and Kaya had decided he would grow up knowing the truth, but not drowning in it. "Papa, will Uncle Marcus be at the festival?" Day asked. "He should be. He wrote saying he would try." Marcus Webb had been released from prison 2 years earlier after serving 8 years of his 10-year sentence. Good behavior and his continued cooperation with authorities hunting down other Broken Ridge perpetrators had earned him early release. He now lived in Santa Fe working with the territorial government on reforming military justice codes. He visited when he could, always bringing gifts for Day, always spending long evenings with Garrett and Kaya talking about the past and the future and the difficult space between. They were friends now, bound by shared guilt and shared redemption by the understanding that some sins could never be fully washed away, but could perhaps be balanced by years of better choices. As they crested the hill overlooking Copper Creek, the town spread out below them, larger now than it had been a decade ago. New buildings, new people. Growth built on the foundation of truth rather than lies. The cemetery was their first stop, as it always was when returning from their teaching circuit through the Apache settlements. 3 graves stood together on the hill, carefully maintained, fresh flowers placed weekly by townspeople who remembered. Isabel Mercer, beloved wife who taught us to live. Dion Thatcher, brother and protector who chose courage over cowardice. Ayasha, sister who deserved better. Garrett dismounted and helped Kaya down, then lifted Day, who ran ahead to place the flowers he had been carefully protecting during the ride. "Grandma Isabel," the boy said solemnly, placing a bouquet on her grave. "I got an A on my spelling test, 20 words all correct." He moved to the second grave. "Uncle Dion, Papa says you were very brave at the end. I want to be brave like you." And finally, to Ayasha's grave. "Aunt Ayasha, Mama tells me you wanted to be a healer. I think I want to be a healer too, or maybe a teacher like Mama. I have not decided yet." Garrett and Kaya stood back, letting Day have his moment with the dead who had shaped their lives. This ritual had become important to all of them, a way of keeping memory alive without letting it consume them. "He is a good boy," Kaya said quietly. "He is. Better than either of us deserved. We did not deserve him, but we earned him. There is a difference." They had found Day in the aftermath of Dion Thatcher's death, the boy's existence a surprise to everyone, including Kaya. Dion had fathered him with a woman from the New Hope Apache settlement, but had never told anyone, ashamed perhaps of bringing a child into a world he saw as broken. The mother had died in childbirth. The boy had been raised by the settlement elders. When Dion died stopping Morrison's final assault on Garrett's ranch, the elders had brought Day to Kaya, saying blood should be with blood. She and Garrett had taken him in without hesitation. And in raising him, they had found something neither expected, not just purpose, but joy. After paying their respects, they rode into town. Copper Creek had prospered in the decades since the trial. The scandal had brought attention, and attention had brought investment. The railroad was coming, scheduled to arrive within 2 years. New shops lined the main street. The population had tripled, but some things remained constant. Mara Calloway still ran the general store, though she now had 3 assistants to help with the increased business. She had never remarried, dedicating herself instead to running a soup kitchen that fed anyone who needed it, regardless of color or origin. She stood on the porch as they approached, her face lighting up. "Garrett, Kaya, and there is my favorite student." She scooped Day into a hug. "I saved some peppermint sticks for you." "Thank you, Aunt Mara." Day accepted the candy with the solemnity of a sacred trust. "How was the circuit?" Mara asked as they entered the store. "Good," Kaya replied. "The settlement at White River has 15 students now. They are learning quickly. And the parents still resistant?" "Some, but less than before. They see their children reading, writing, calculating numbers. They see doors opening that were always closed. That changes minds more than any speech." Mara nodded approvingly. "I have mail for you. Came yesterday from Santa Fe." She handed over a thick envelope. Garrett recognized Webb's handwriting immediately. Inside was a letter and a newspaper clipping. Garrett read the clipping first, then closed his eyes, feeling a weight he had carried for 10 years suddenly lift. "What is it?" Kaya asked. "Hayes. They found him." The room went silent. Even Day, young as he was, understood the significance of that name. Kaya took the clipping with shaking hands. The headline read, "Broken Ridge Fugitive Captured in Sonora. Lieutenant Cullen Hayes to face trial." Below was a photograph. Hayes looked older, harder, a decade of running having carved his face into something wolfish and mean. But it was definitely him. Webb's letter provided details the newspaper did not. Hayes had been living in a small village near the Gulf of California under an assumed name, working as a ranch foreman. A former soldier had recognized him and alerted authorities. Mexican officials had cooperated fully with extradition. The trial was set for September in Santa Fe. Webb wrote that both Garrett and Kaya would be called to testify. "After all this time," Kaya whispered, "I had begun to think he would die free." "Justice moves slowly," Garrett said, "but it moves." That evening they gathered at the house Garrett had built on the outskirts of town. It was larger than the old ranch cabin, with multiple rooms and a ramp for Kaya's wheelchair and space for Day to play. The barn had been converted into Kaya's school with desks and books and maps on the walls. Around the dinner table sat their chosen family. Mara, Doc Harrison, now 78, but still practicing medicine. Rosa Mendoza, who had stayed in Copper Creek after the trial vindicated her late husband's name, running a boarding house for travelers and quietly helping any Apache passing through town. And Marcus Webb, who had indeed made it for the festival, his face showing the years in prison, but his eyes clearer than Garrett remembered. "To justice," Webb said, raising his glass. "Finally complete." "Not complete," Kaya corrected. "Hayes still breathes. When he faces trial, when he is convicted, when he serves his sentence, then justice will be complete." "Fair enough. To justice arriving even if late." They drank, the conversation flowing easily. Day fell asleep on the couch, exhausted from the long ride. The adults talked long into the night, sharing stories and memories, marking another year survived, another year built on the ruins of the past. Near midnight, after the guests had left and Day had been carried to bed, Garrett and Kaya sat on their porch watching the stars emerge over the desert. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had left you in the desert that day?" Garrett asked. "I would have died. You would have drunk your laudanum within the month. The truth about Broken Ridge would have stayed buried. Morrison and Hayes would have lived free. Isabel's sacrifice would have been wasted. One choice, one moment, changed everything. Not one moment, many moments. You chose to save me. You chose to open Isabel's grave. You chose truth over safety. I chose testimony over revenge. We chose each other. All of those choices, day after day, year after year. That is what changed everything." Garrett reached over and took her hand. Their relationship had evolved slowly over the years, from allies to friends to something deeper. They had married 5 years ago, a quiet ceremony with just their closest friends. Not a romance of passion, but something more enduring. A partnership forged in shared trauma and mutual respect, and the understanding that they had saved each other in ways that went beyond the physical. "I never thought I would love again after Isabel," Garrett said quietly. "Did not think I deserved to. And now I understand that love is not a reward for being good. It is a choice to be good. Isabel loved me enough to force me to change. You loved me enough to accept that I did." Kaya leaned her head on his shoulder. "You make it sound so noble. Sometimes I think I just got used to you, like one gets used to an old coat that fits well." Garrett laughed, the sound genuine and warm. "An old coat. How romantic." "Romance is for young people with more hope than sense. We are old people with more sense than hope. We do not need romance. We have something better." "What is that bond, truth?" and the knowledge that we faced the worst of ourselves and did not look away. They sat in comfortable silence as the night deepened around them. In the distance, a coyote called. The wind moved through the sage, the desert breathed its ancient rhythm. Inside Day slept peacefully, dreaming innocent dreams, protected by the shield his parents had built from their broken pieces. 4 months later, September 1891, they returned to Santa Fe for Hayes's trial. The courtroom was familiar territory now, though the faces had changed. Judge Ward had retired. Prosecutor Whitmore had moved to Washington, but the process remained the same. Justice grinding forward with inevitable patience. Hayes sat at the defense table, thinner than in the photograph, his eyes hollow. 10 years of running had aged him 2 decades. He looked like a man who knew the rope was waiting and had made his peace with it. Kaya testified first, her voice strong and clear, recounting the same story she had told 10 years earlier. But this time, when she pointed to the man responsible, he was in the room. That man, Lieutenant Cullen Hayes, shot Nietzsche while his hands were raised in surrender, shot his wife when she tried to help him, then ordered his men to fire on everyone who ran. He laughed while children died. He set fire to buildings where people hid. He murdered my sister and 52 others. And then he ran like the coward he is. Hayes's attorney, a tired-looking public defender who knew his case was hopeless, tried to create doubt. Tried to suggest Kaya's memory was unreliable after 10 years. Tried to argue that the fog of battle made it impossible to know who shot whom. But the evidence was overwhelming. 13 soldiers from Hayes's unit had testified at Morrison's trial. All of them confirmed Kaya's account. Hayes had given the orders. Hayes had fired first. Hayes had turned a tense situation into a massacre. The jury deliberated for 3 hours, long enough to review the evidence, not long enough to suggest any real doubt. Guilty on all counts. Sentencing came the next day. Judge Robert Chambers Ward's successor showed no mercy. Lieutenant Cullen Hayes, you have been found guilty of 53 counts of murder. 53 lives taken without justification, without honor, without humanity. You are a disgrace to the uniform you wore and the nation you claimed to serve. This court sentences you to death by hanging, sentenced to be carried out 60 days from today. May God have mercy on your soul, for this court has none. Hayes showed no reaction. He simply nodded as if the verdict confirmed what he had always known. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed again. But this time the questions were different. Not about justice delayed, but about closure finally achieved. Miss Kaya, how do you feel knowing Hayes will hang? Kaya considered the question carefully. I feel that justice has been served, but I do not feel joy. Hanging Hayes will not bring back my sister. It will not undo Broken Ridge. It simply closes a chapter that should never have been written. Mr. Mercer, you have dedicated 10 years to seeing this through. What will you do now? Garrett looked at Kaya at Day, holding her hand at the life they had built from ashes. Now we go home. We teach. We build. We live. That is the only revenge worth having. To survive. To thrive. To prove that hate did not win. 60 days later, on a cold November morning, Cullen Hayes was hanged in the courtyard of the Santa Fe Territorial Prison. Garrett and Kaya did not attend. They had no desire to watch a man die, even one who deserved it. Instead, they spent that morning at the cemetery in Copper Creek, standing before the 3 graves that had come to define their journey. It is finished, Kaya said simply. Garrett looked at the 3 graves, Isabel Dion Ayasha, and shook his head slowly. Is it? The dead are still dead. The past is still the past. Yes, Kaya's voice was gentle. But the future is still being written, and we get to write it now. Not Morrison, not Hayes, not the ghosts. She turned to face him. Us. Garrett thought about the past 10 years, the school they had built, the students they had taught Apache and white children sitting side by side learning that the other was human, the son they were raising who knew the truth but was not crushed by it. the marriage they had forged from shared trauma and mutual respect. He looked at Kaya, this woman who had been a stranger dying in the desert and had become his partner, his compass, his reason to keep choosing life over death. "Yes," he said finally, "I think I have." Then her sacrifice was not wasted. Kaya reached for his hand. "Nor Ayasha's death, nor Dion's. They lived through what we built from their loss." Day came running back from the far end of the cemetery, his face flushed with excitement. "Papa, Mama, look what I found." He held up a small turtle, its head peeking cautiously from its shell. "A desert tortoise," Garrett said, kneeling beside his son. "They live for 100 years, some of them, longer than we will. Can we keep him?" "No." Kaya smiled, the expression transforming her scarred face into something almost peaceful. "He belongs to the desert, like we do. We just borrow our time here." Day carefully set the tortoise down, watching it lumber away toward the scrub. Then he slipped his small hand into Garrett's. "Papa, can we come back next week? I want to tell Grandma Isabel about my spelling test." "We will," Garrett promised. "Every week, as long as you want." They walked back toward their horses together. Father, mother, son, leaving the 3 graves behind them. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the chill. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals toward the mountains. The desert breathed its ancient rhythm, indifferent and eternal. At the cemetery gate, Kaya paused and looked back one final time. "Goodbye," she whispered, not to the dead but to the past. Garrett heard her and understood. He squeezed her hand once, then lifted Day onto his horse. As they rode toward Copper Creek, toward home, toward breakfast, toward another ordinary day in their extraordinary life, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of sage and something sweeter. Spring flowers, new growth, the future pushing up through the bones of the past. Behind them on the hill, the 3 graves stood silent in the sun. The wind moved through the cemetery, rustling the flowers on the headstones. And if you listened carefully, if you believed in such things, you might have heard something that sounded almost like peace. The end.